Welcome to Microsoft's Insurance Corner with your presenters, Steve Walker, Cloud and AI Platform Specialist at Microsoft.
And I'm Heather Haley, Insurance Account CTO at Microsoft. With this series, we aim to cut through the noise to bring you practical insight on the Microsoft technologies reshaping the insurance sector. From agentic AI to data platforms, developer experience, security, and the future of underwriting and claims.
This series is designed to give leaders and practitioners clear, actionable perspectives you can take straight back into your organisation. No hype, just real conversations, real expertise, and real value. Thank you for joining us. Let's get into today's discussion. And Heather, we were joined with Chris Green today, and he brought, I thought, a very interesting and personal opinion and perspective on the bereavement process within insurance and financial services at large.
Yes, exactly. I have to admit, I was very impressed by both his professional perspective, but also his personal one. He managed to bring the whole segment and the whole customer journey to life, and that was really powerful. Yeah,
we get into a good discussion around about what the future holds. So there's some good stuff cooking on the horizon when it comes to the government, like this Tell Us Once scheme, for example. That sounds very, very exciting indeed. But we also dove into how AI and how Microsoft are able to support this journey going forward. And I thought it was quite an interesting episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to sharing it with everyone.
Let's go. Today's guest is Chris Green. Chris, thank you for being on the podcast today. Welcome.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here with you, so thank you.
No, you are more than welcome. Do you want to take just a couple of minutes to introduce yourself and say hi to everyone?
Absolutely, yeah. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Chris Green. I'm what we call an account technology strategist or an account CTO here in Microsoft, looking after financial services accounts. I've been in the role for nearly 10 years. 4 of that was in the insurance market, looking after some of the major retail and life and pensions insurance organisations. But now I look after one of the UK leading high street banks, which includes an insurance arm as part of it as well.
Fantastic. And I know, Chris, you're doing some really exciting things at the moment in the life and pensions space, which is why we were very excited to have you on the podcast today. If you don't mind, would you walk us through sort of the problems you're trying to solve, the challenges that we're facing in that space?
Sure.
We'd love to dive in.
Absolutely, yeah. So we got approached by the bank, around about 12 months ago, in terms of supporting them with the processes around life assurance, around bereavement, particularly. It's a very difficult area, and it's a very emotional area for a lot of people who go through this. I know, Steve, we've chatted before that you went through this last year. I went through this last year with a family member, in terms of, the burden of processing a lot of these things falls on the bereaved. So at a particularly emotional, fragile point, people are, trying to make claims on life assurance policies that they're not entirely sure, does their loved one who's passed away even have a policy? So there's a lot of things that are, wrapped up into this. And what we're really looking at is actually how can technology, start to take away some of that burden on the bereaved. Now, what's really interesting, I think, in this process is that, it's actually the process in terms of how long it takes depends on the policy that the person has. So if you're doing things like the guaranteed over 50s plans, for example, the processing time is roughly, within 20 days. But typically those are smaller sums. It's a much quicker process. For things like the, individual life terms or the full life terms, where it's a lot more complicated, the average time to process that is somewhere between 53 to 122 days.
Wow.
So that's a massive period of time. I'm really looking in terms of why is it that it takes so long, and actually how can technology speed up that process? Now, whilst it takes a really long time, what's really interesting is that actually the success rates in terms of those life assurance claims being paid out is really high. It's consistently high. It's like 96%, is the average. Individual organisations, typically somewhere between 97 and 99% of these claims do get paid out. So really it's around looking at what are the pinch points, what are the blockers, and really where can we support on that. And some of the things that we've discovered, and especially as the process as it is at the moment, we've already talked about, the process, it's very reactive, so it relies on the person who is bereaved, ringing up an insurer, ringing up a financial services organization and stating the fact that, such and such has passed away. Do they have a policy? Is there existing, is that customer known to us? Who is that person who's ringing up? There's a whole load of checks that need to take place. So there's checks along the lines of, the person who's passed away, what's their policy? Does their policy match what they've done? What medical information is needed to be able to support the fact? So things like cause of death is a key area that needs to get checked. Where does that information come from? Do we know the person? Is there a beneficiary listed on the policy? That's actually one of those areas where sometimes there isn't. So then it opens up things like having to go through probate, to actually be able to kind of prove that that person is the person who is going to be receiving the money. So all of those checks kind of stand in the way.
Yeah, and the probate process can take a very, very long time indeed, can't it? And I think it's a case of communicating, giving regular updates is what you'd expect. I think if you are, like you said, bereaved and you're going through this process, to be kept in the loop is a very, very important thing indeed.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's overlooked as well is that it may be that the bereaved doesn't have an account or a policy with this particular organisation. This would be their one and only interface perhaps with them. So it's possibly a chance to either convince them that they're a decent organisation, or if the experience doesn't go particularly smoothly, it could end up negatively impacting the reputation of that brand.
It absolutely could. And, having gone through this is the reliance on the bereaved to actually contact every organisation, that the person who has passed away, did have a policy or an account with. And sometimes that process, even within an organisation, is really fragmented. So, you need to have a death certificate for every account that, that person had to be able to prove to that organisation. Now, if you're sending that several times to the same organisation, which, in the worst case scenario could happen, then that's really not a good experience. So actually what can be done in terms of that improvement to say, almost tell us once, so tell us once that this person has passed away. And actually, how does that then get shared out, between the rest of that organisation to make that process as seamless as possible? And the whole kind of intent, especially when you were just talking, Steve, in terms of, making it less reliant on the person who's bereaved, is how can you make this process less reactive, more proactive? So it becomes more of a question of, we understand that this has happened. We're really sorry. Actually, this is where we are in the process. This is what we are looking to do to try and make this as easy as possible. And the fact that most of the claims, the vast majority of the claims get paid out, it's really around just proving the different policy steps or the different steps that need to take place just to kind of get to that payment stage, which a lot of the time is inevitable. And organizations, I think, are a lot more moving towards how much of that can we actually pass through 95% of that just to be a automated process. So actually where you're focusing your time is on the 5%, whether there is a question mark around, the policy details, or, there might be some detailed medical information that's required, but that is the exception rather than the rule.
Remember, you can get in touch with the show on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you with feedback, thoughts, and even suggestions for the future episodes. Now back to the show. Love that. Chris, it sounds like this has been an incredibly manual process to date for a lot of banks and insurers to manage. Obviously, AI is quite a big opportunity. This seems to be the number one buzzword as at the moment. What do you think the AI opportunity is around this process, or not necessarily AI? Actually, I think we tend to go straight to AI and we miss scenarios around automation and the role of data. Would love to hear your perspective on what you think the improvement areas could be.
I think there's a number of things, and I think the point that you actually just hit on, really well there, and something that Steve had mentioned, is that it's not really the banks or the financial services organisations that are struggling with the process. I would say it's probably the bereaved at this point, because they're the ones who are having to initiate it. They're the ones who are having to gather the information. They're the ones who are either having to get the death certificates or trying to gather the information from the GP, on a medical report, that kind of thing. So there's things like that around how actually could you make that process easier. Once you've got access to that information, be that a process, claim form or medical information, you absolutely could use document intelligence to be able to gather the information from that. You can use it, AI to be able to verify who a person is, using a passport image or using a driver's license image to be able to gather the information. That's really key. So there's already kind of work going on in that space, I would say. There are organizations that are already looking at what they can do. We're certainly interested in doing that as well. I've box capabilities within our stack to be able to do that. But the point you raised around, is it AI or is it, intelligent automation, actually, I think is a really key point. That actually a lot of this you could automate. Now, whether that is, passing information through from one part of the financial services organization into another to say, right, we've received this notification of loss. Do we know this customer? Is this customer known to us elsewhere in the bank? That's there's a certain amount of AI in that, but a lot of that is really process automation. And going, right, okay, yep, we do. We can check this against our, master customer information. We know this person exists. What information do you need? Name, date of birth, postcode, is the minimal perhaps amount that you need. Yep, we know who that is. Therefore, we can now start to process that in another part of the bank, like in the retail part, for example, or, on a mortgage or kind of similar. So there's those different steps. And what we're looking at doing at the moment is almost the end to end. We've talked a lot about the point where, the bereavement has happened. There's a bit there around, okay, how do you provide access to that information easier? I talked about Tell Us Once. There is a government service called Tell Us Once, which, has got an API connected to it where you subscribe to. And that will tell you, eventually that somebody has kind of passed away. There's certain things that are in there. What it doesn't provide access to are things like the medical reports. So that's still very much, protected and as it should be. But what point, can you start to gather that information? Actually, for a lot of the processes that go through, do you need that medical information? Getting that notification of this person has passed away as a notification to kick off the process internally might be enough. That when the bereaved person then rings up to say, this person has passed away, there could be very much more a proactive, yes, we know, we're very sorry about it, this is what we're doing about it. And I think, so definitely areas where AI can support, but also a lot of things that you could be doing from an automation perspective, especially throughout the life cycle of that claim, from the point where the claim is taken out, so the onboarding process, when the customer, makes that, takes out the policy in the first place, what could you do there, through to the triage of it, all the way through to payment. So I think, technology absolutely has a role to play.
Yeah, I remember when I went through this, it was back in 2020, the amount of times I had to repeat myself, and there was data they had half the data, but parts of it were missing. And again, it was just having to it felt like I was typing this in the same form lots and lots of times with lots of different organizations.
And I think that's, if you were to look at that in a single organisation, and I think it's difficult when it's multiple organisations because you get into the IP of each of those different orgs. But okay, using AI within a phone call, to be able to kind of gather the information that the customer is telling you at the point that they're telling you, recording that in the background, then being able to process that, kind of pass that through a different part of the bank or centralise that. So actually you've got that information that another part of the organisation can then call on. I think it's hugely valuable. So it's not reliant on one system, it's actually being federated out across.
Heather and I have got some great ideas for episodes lined up in the future. So remember to subscribe to Insurance Corner wherever you get your podcasts. Now back to the show. In terms of reporting a bereavement, what have you seen in terms of, I guess I think I know the answer to this, right? You would probably want to speak to a human and you still rely on contact centres and picking up the phone. But is there any appetite have you seen from the organisations you work with to try and digitise that at all? Are people expectations changing in terms of being able to report bereavements?
Yeah, I think there are. I think there's a lot of things are going up. I mean, especially from a retail bank perspective, it's less about branch, it's more about online, it's more about the app capability. And you're right. I think for that, you probably still want to talk to somebody. There is a question mark at the moment, I would say, in terms of how proactive are you with those comms? So, if you've received notification that somebody has passed away and it's not the bereaved who's kind of rung up, is it okay, is it ethical almost to reach out to them proactively if you know who they are, to say, right, we understand this has happened? Probably not at the moment. I think that's probably too much of an intrusion. But having a note on there that when they do ring up the contact centre already has awareness of it and can say, yeah, like I say, it becomes far more empathetic. So it's not the first time they've heard it. They do understand it and they know. So there is definitely a shift, going back to the question, of moving more to an app or an online portal where you can start to process that. I think it'll then be down to the individual, obviously. What we are seeing is, especially at that onboarding stage, how could that be processed, better? Could you do that through an app? And absolutely you could. It's the same as opening any kind of account. Right, okay, who are you? Are you already known to us? What information do we need from you to be able to create a claim? What medical information do we need from you? All of that, you could very much see that being automated through an app, through an online portal, where you've got a chatbot kind of capability to be able to do that, rather than having to rely on or getting the bottleneck of speaking to a new policy creator through a human. And it's an interesting one in terms of one of the other challenges I think that life insurance organisations have is training, recruiting claims assessors. There's a big backlog, I would say, in that space. And typically it takes, 3 to 6 months to train staff on that claims process. It kind of extends to 12 months if you want to get full proficiency. And there's a lot of challenge. There's a lot of kind of, not fighting, but challenge for resources in that space. Again, it becomes that, is that an area that AI or technology could start to remove that burden? That actually, okay, those claims processors, those claims assessors are focusing on those 5%, which are really important, or there's kind of challenges around exactly how the person passed away or against the policy, and actually the rest of it is completely automated, and you could get an AI kind of process to be able to do that. It removes that constraint on that recruitment and training of those claims processors.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Just thinking out loud, team, you've both obviously mentioned that you've gone through this process yourself quite recently. Do you think there's a benefit in having some personal choice around that interaction with these financial service organizations? So do you think if you had a choice, you would have preferred to engage with an app versus a person? Do you think there's some potential opportunity there to explore different channels that would give each individual, depending on how they grieve, for example, a choice in that matter?
I can go first on that one. I think there is I'm not going to say it's generational. I definitely think it's down to the individual. I didn't go through it personally. I was supporting others who were going through that process. And I think probably the biggest challenge or the biggest concern was the number of times it needed to be repeated. And I think, Steve has kind of said this in terms of how many times you have to repeat yourself for different organizations, different accounts. And seeing, my kind of loved one having to go through that in terms of the number of, going to the local council to get multiple copies of a death certificate, which costs X amount each time for each death certificate. There is a certain amount of inefficiency, I would say, to that process. And you go, actually, well, you could do it once. How could you do it once, and how could that replicate it across the different organizations so you don't have to keep repeating? I definitely think there is still the element of personal touch, but that very much is down to the individual. I'll let Steve, give his opinion on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I may be a bad example because it was 2020. We all know what happened then, and the world was completely turned upside down. And I think, and of course, right, this was essentially pre-AI. So I think my appetite for doing things digitally may very well be different if it's, say, it happened today. But back in 2020, I think, it was the human touch, right? We did just want the confidence that you'd picked up the phone and that someone had heard you and confirmed that they'd heard you. And and they will give you a little reassuring message that say, we will, this is what the next steps will be. And we will be back in touch soon. And if you haven't heard from us, here are the channels that you can reach out to chase.
I think what's really compelling, and I think there is a real desire within the industry, not just within the account that I look after. There's definitely a desire there, but I think there is a wider desire within the industry to make this process better. and to make it less onerous on the bereaved, and to kind of get that process a lot better. If they're paying out, 97 to 99% of the time, it's not about these institutions are, untrustworthy and don't want to pay out the money. They are paying out the money. They're paid out, I think it was like 7.3 billion in 2023 on life insurance. These are large numbers. It's not about controlling that. It's more there are processes in place and they're very much open, looking at ways of being able to improve that.
Chris, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. If the folks listening would like to get in touch with you, how's the best way to find you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. I am down as Chris Green. You'll recognise me because I'll be there wearing a black hoodie, which is my standard uniform. It'll be, Chris Green, account CTO. And yeah, more than happy for people to reach out, ask any questions. Thanks very much for inviting me on today again.
You are more than welcome. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
So there we have it. That was Chris Green. Heather, how did you think that episode went?
I thought it was brilliant, and I just want to take a quick minute, if you don't mind, just to say a thank you to both you and Chris for sharing your personal perspective. I appreciate it's a very emotive conversation, the bereavement journey, and I really thought you and Chris brought it to life by sharing that insight.
Hey, I would more than happy to share if it looks like this is going to change and transform for the better for all the people who go through it, right? Besides, mine was a long time ago. It was a very tumultuous time then, but it did highlight some of the inadequacies that were there and how things could be done differently. And I do think that AI is just so ripe to change this kind of stuff. And I think hopefully that episode highlighted it and what Chris was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what was an interesting perspective with AI in this process was still this need for choice. So obviously in the episode we talk a little bit around people having the option to pick like a human representative versus an agent and a sort of fully digital experience as well. And I assume sort of going through that bereavement journey, that's quite a powerful option for these big brands, these big FSI orgs to provide. So it was fabulous to hear the technology ramping up in that regard to support it.
That's right. And what he was saying about it taking anywhere between 50 to well over 100 days, depending on lots of different factors like the number of beneficiaries. I think that it's just so ripe to be able to bring that down. And it was great to see that, AI will be able to do that. But like you said, don't lose sight of the fact that this is a very emotional time. And to offer people the choice of a human touch versus being able to report it digitally, either way, institutions need to be able to support both journeys and ensure that is as less stress inducing as possible at their time of need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the final thing I was going to say was, as you mentioned, there's a lot going on in this space, and Chris alluded to a couple of conversations that are happening with the ecosystem. So I'm really looking forward to bringing Chris on to the podcast in the future, where we can sort of talk more openly about how tech is transforming that wider process.
Yeah, I've said before, Chris is welcome back anytime. I think it would be very valuable to have him back on. Okay, brilliant. Let's leave it there then. So if you folks have enjoyed anything that we have produced, Heather and I, over the last 6 weeks, please do leave us a review wherever you find your podcast. It really does help us out. But that's it from us, and we'll see you again soon on Insurance Corner.
Perfect. Take care, everyone.